Hello and welcome to UnZOOsual Careers, where we explore the variety of careers in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. My name is Shelley, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'll be your host for today. Before we meet today's guest, you will see two polls pop up on your screen. The first, have you ever heard of an animal nutritionist, yes or no? And second, which of the following subjects do you think is involved in animal nutrition? Science, technology, engineering, art, or math? While you take time to answer that poll, I'm going to go over the format of today's program. This webinar is live captioned. You'll want to locate that CC button at the bottom of your screen for those to appear. You will also notice that this program is being interpreted in American Sign Language. This feature is best viewed from a desktop computer rather than a tablet or phone. If you are having trouble with either of these services, please chat us so we can assist you. Remember, this is a webinar, so we cannot see or hear you. However, we encourage you to engage with us in a number of ways. As you already saw, we will be launching polls throughout the program today. Additionally, you will see that the Q&A is open. Please use the Q&A at any time to ask questions of our guest. Try to keep your questions on topic, and you can always check under the My Questions column to see if your question was already answered. Today's program will be about 45 minutes with an additional 15 minutes at the end for the live Q&A, where we will answer as many of your questions as time will allow. Educators, if you are streaming for your whole class, be sure to keep your keyboard close to chime in on their behalf. Lastly, you'll see that that chat is open for you to message us. And I want you to now find that chat, tell us your name and where you are joining from, and maybe if you can answer our riddle of what do cows like to put on their sandwiches. While you find the chat and answer those questions, I do want to quickly introduce my team helping behind the scenes. Today we have Erica, Kaden, and Emily answering your questions. And we also have a very special chat expert. Today joining us is Mike Maslenka, the senior nutritionist and head of the Department of Nutrition Sciences here at the National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. So you may see some responses from him in the chat as well. Oh, we did get some people answering both the riddle and where they're joining us from. Let's take a look. We have Mr. Hamilton's class from Laguna Creek High School in Elk Grove, California. Welcome. We have Alex joining from Cleveland, Ohio. Lydia and Roland all the way from Oregon. Class from River Terrace Education Campus in DCPS, so local to DC. Welcome. We have Ani from Virginia. Other folks from Portland, Oregon, Noah and Ivy from Missouri. Let's see, more Oregon. Oh, Monterey Train High School in Sacramento, California. And some other folks from Smedberg Middle School in Elk Grove, California. Ashley, more Elk Grove, California. Eugene, Oregon, Beaverton, Oregon. And so many folks got our riddle correct. What do cows like to put on their sandwiches? And the answer is mustard. So some of you definitely got it. Thank you all for joining us. Oh, and a special deaf classroom from Elk Grove, Edward Harris Middle School. Very welcome to everybody joining. So once again, welcome to UnZOOsual Careers. I am thrilled to welcome our guest today, Erin Kendrick. Welcome, Erin.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Why don't you start by telling us what it is you do at the National Zoo?
I am the clinical animal nutritionist here at the zoo.
So when I think of the word nutrition, I think of eating my healthy foods like fruits and vegetables. Audience, feel free to chime in the chat. What do you think of when you hear the word nutrition? And Erin, what does a clinical animal nutritionist do?
Well, in short, I create and maintain the diets for all of the zoo's animals to ensure that they are healthy and that their nutritional needs are being met.
That's great. Yeah, we have lots of chat answers, healthy foods, carrots, for sure. So I know that the zoo here, the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., we have over 360 species of animals. So you're coming up with the diet for each of those species?
Yes, everything from our smallest frog up to our big elephants need to have appropriately formulated diets. They can't all eat the same thing, and nutrient requirements can vary between species. So making sure that everybody has what it is they need is the basis of my job.
So how do you even begin to know what all 360 species need to eat? Are you going off of what they're eating in the wild?
Not exactly, because what these animals do eat in the wild, we can't really replicate that exactly here at the zoo. I don't also know necessarily what all these animals would be eating in the wild, so no one really has that information. But we can make educated guesses based on what we do know about those wild type diets and what type of digestive tract those animals have. We can rely on knowledge of well-studied species, which are going to be mostly our domesticated animals, as we'll get into a little bit later. And what we would expect them to have similar nutrient requirements for based on those domestic species or other studies.
So you're looking at similar animals that we know their diets and then kind of creating the similar diets off of that.
Yeah, basically similar in that we're trying to provide a similar nutrient profile or one that meets the needs for that animal using foods that we can get commercially, like what you might get in the grocery store. Since I mentioned I can't replicate wild diets, we do know that every animal has a range for each nutrient that must be met. So we're creating diets to include foods that will fall within these ranges, even if it's a food that that animal would actually never eat in the wild.
Okay, so you're using what maybe our viewers are feeding their dogs or their cats for similar species.
Sure, sort of. We do have several species that would be getting foods that are formulated for pets, and those would be included in their diets, similar to cats or dogs. But also, if you think about a cow or a goat, that might actually be a good model or starting place for a gazelle diet. Similarly, a horse might actually be a good model for our Przewalski's horse, or maybe even a zebra. Where it gets interesting for me is when a species doesn't really fit into one specific model. We don't have many domestic species, for example, that maybe eat like a porcupine or the pandas, for example. And if I have a carnivorous bird like a vulture or maybe an eagle, am I referring to cat recommendations or a chicken or both? Maybe neither. What about pelicans? They're a carnivorous bird, but they exclusively eat fish. So perhaps no model really works great for them, but we kind of have to work with what we've got. So we also really rely on information from zoo-based research, scientists conducting academic and field-based research, and of course, upon the decades of expertise and experience gained by zoos and nutritionists successfully feeding these animals.
So you're really just creating these diets based on what we know. And I'm going to launch another poll here for our audience. Let's see which, Erin uses the diet of a dog as the model for the diet of which of the following animals do you think? A bear, a cheetah, a tortoise, or a red panda? Let's see if we can guess what this model is. You can guess it in the poll or put your answers in the chat to see how she does this. I'll give you another few seconds on that poll. So that is really interesting to think about. Like you mentioned, there are some species that don't exactly model, like you said, a porcupine or a carnivorous bird that you wouldn't necessarily model after a domesticated bird.
Sure.
So I'll give you another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 on that poll. Let's see what people guessed. I'll share these results. So it looks like most people guessed bear, followed closely by red panda. So what do you use a dog to model a diet for?
Actually, mostly for a bear in this example. You can use it to some degree for a red panda, even though their diet is very different. But believe it or not, dogs can actually really help us model some of our bear diets. Also, some other canid species like our wolves or a fox, something like that. But even now, we're still learning how to properly feed bears, for example. I just saw a new article that changes what we thought we knew about feeding polar bears just within the last couple of weeks. And new information like this really helps us fill in the gaps in our knowledge and kind of shows when that model might be appropriate to a degree, but just doesn't quite match up when you start to extrapolate to a greater extent. So even now we're learning more about where those models work and where they might not.
So fascinating. It's always evolving. And of course, we have a ton of large cats here at the National Zoo as well. We have some lions and tigers and cheetahs and clouded leopards and bobcats. And so are they all getting fed similarly to maybe our viewers' cats at home?
Almost. Just like cats at your home, The cats here are going to be getting a nutritionally similar diet. It's balanced for their nutritional needs, and they are going to match up for the most part with a domesticated cat. However, our diets are probably a little bit different in the way that they are formed, and certainly in much larger quantities. For all of the felids that you just mentioned, their diet is actually a complete raw beef-based diet that we would supplement with bones, whole rabbits or rodents, and on occasion, some larger carcass pieces such as cow legs or ribs.
Got it. So that's actually a really great example that you mentioned. We can't exactly replicate what they're eating in the wild, but this is a good example of us providing both the experience and the nutrient profile, like you mentioned, you know, as we see here, some lions and some cheetahs eating some of those carcasses, that it's not going to be necessarily what they've eaten in the wild, but again, to the same extent, pretty similar. So again, you mentioned that we can't exactly replicate what they eat in the wild, but wouldn't that be the best way to ensure that we are meeting their nutritional needs?
You know, that would seem pretty obvious, but for a lot of the animals in our care, their wild diet and environment can be in constant flux. They're often navigating times of great differences in food availability. They have to make choices every day based on survival, and the foods we observe them eating at isolated points of the year or their life might not actually represent their overall needs over the entire course of a year or their life. You know, if I were to base a zoo orangutan diet on the foods a scientist observed just one group feeding in one forest during one part of their season, that diet might actually be pretty terrible nutritionally because it's missing a lot of the parts that they might be consuming over the rest of the year or in other locations within their environment. So while that information is valuable, I wouldn't have a full picture for what they're eating, and there are parts that are missing. And again, then, even if I did know everything an animal eats in the wild, I most likely can't actually get to those items. And if I could, I would need to know the nutrient composition of every item in order to actually create a balanced diet and to know what proportion each food item should be within the total diet. We just don't have all that information. And lastly, in some cases, it actually would be pretty irresponsible for me to offer a wild diet item because it's possible for that plant or animal to actually be threatened or endangered in its own environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes a very good point about why saving endangered species habitats are so important, because when we are conserving their habitat, we're conserving all of their food items. So if an animal is living in a potentially stressed habitat that doesn't have all of their food items available, what you're going off of what they're eating in the wild might not be the complete diet. If someone were to take a snapshot of what I eat in a day, they'd probably see a lot of coffee rather than the whole profile of what I eat throughout the day. So we did have a question that someone pointed out in the picture of all of those carcass feedings. That animal on the right was a Komodo dragon. Yes, you are correct, Sue. So let's take a look at some of these very unique. There's the Komodo dragon on the right. On the top, that's some lions going after a carcass, and at the bottom left is some cheetahs. So let's take a look at some of these pretty general animal diets. Remember that Q&A is open if you have any questions for Erin. So let's get right to it. So this is a Baltimore Oriole. So what is a Baltimore Oriole really eating for most of the day?
So our captive diet is what you're seeing in this diagram. And this is going to consist of a lot of insects. This picture is of mealworms, but they will also be getting waxworms and crickets as a part of that mix. There's a pellet produce mix. That's going to include a commercially manufactured pellet, similar to what we talked about with dog and cat diets. This is formulated for birds, so it's smaller as well. But it's going to be mixed with a variety of fruits and vegetables. And then that egg mix is going to increase not just the protein content of that diet, but also add in some eggshell, particularly for that laying season when they've got a lot of eggs that are going to be produced. We want to make sure the calcium levels are high enough to support that. This particular diet actually looks like this is a breeding season diet. It's got a high level of insects and a pretty low level of the other items for that current part of the diet.
That's great. And for all of our viewers, as we run through these examples, throw in the chat which of the diets you would be most interested in eating if you were an animal. So next up, we have our gorilla. What makes up the majority of the gorilla diet we're looking at?
So right here, it's pretty clear the greens are the largest proportion of that diet. Gorillas are very folivorous, and so that's going to be a pretty big component of their captive diet as well. It's going to make up the bulk of the diet. They're also going to get another version of a commercially manufactured pellet. You see that at 16% of their diet. That one, again, is going to be formulated to meet primate nutrition needs. And then we've also got some smaller levels of root type vegetables, so sweet potatoes, turnips, beets, things like that. Small amount of fruit, and then a slightly larger proportion of vegetables. Fruit's actually a pretty small proportion of diets. We're trying to really reduce the amount of fruit we're using in many of our diets. We've really come to learn that even though a healthy diet for human is going to include a lot of greens and vegetables and fruits, fruits aren't necessarily the healthiest thing for a lot of our wild primate counterparts. It's kind of like their cookies and cakes, if you will. And so we're really trying to control that to make sure that they are as healthy as possible.
We had a lot of people in the chat say that so far this is their preferred diet. Sethi said that they're a vegan, so this definitely probably aligns very well with their diet at home. Great. Oh, next up we have an elephant, which looks kind of similar, but a ton of hay.
Right, and that's one of the things you might notice as we go through some of these diets is that many of them are going to contain similar components, and that's just because the situation we're in with what is commercially available to us, we're going to use similar items in different diets. It's just going to be corrected for what proportion is appropriate for that animal. So in the case of the elephant, being a hindgut fermenter or very herbivorous animal, the bulk of their diet is going to be hay, up to 80%, potentially even more. A very small amount of pellet. The pellet in this case is formulated for our elephants, but it's also a very concentrated pellet, which means that it has a high level of the nutrients that they need to balance out that hay, but is going to allow us to feed a lower proportion of that in their diet so that we can manage body condition and make sure that they're staying at a good weight range. And then we'll use the produce and the browse kind of as management tools or for training.
So you mentioned the pellets that a lot of our animals are getting. So it's very similar to the kibble that you might be feeding your dogs or your cats, but specially designed nutritionally for these specific species. I think that's so fascinating. And Strauss in the chat said the elephant's diet looks pretty similar to their rabbit's diet with the amount of greens and hay and pellets.
Yeah, good point. Another hindgut fermenter, but just on a much smaller scale.
Amazing. All right, so the sea lion, this one looks very different from the other ones that we have seen, as everything here looks like fish.
Yeah, so we certainly have a couple animals within the zoo that are exclusively piscivores or fish eaters. And so that's what's reflected here in the sea lion diet. The bulk of their diet is going to be fish, and then there's a smaller amount of squid. Squid tends to be one of their favorite things. So we make sure that that's in there for training sessions and things like that. We also try to make sure that we have a good mix of fish. These are wild caught but managed populations that we are purchasing from. And so as populations in the wild fluctuate and availability comes and goes, we want to make sure that we always have at least 2 or 3 fish that these animals are going to be consistently seeing. And so if one needs to be reduced or goes away for a period of time, we've got others that can fill in those gaps.
That's great. Gwen said that this is what their cat would want to eat. I think this might be my preferred diet as well. Erin, we did have a question. Can you clarify, you mentioned browse, that we feed out browse.
Yeah,
what is browse?
So browse is basically any plant material that you might consider coming from a tree or a bush that's not a grass or a hay. And most of the time you'd be seeing this being offered to the animals, to the zoo during the growing season. So late spring into mid to late fall, depending on availability. And it's just another forage source for these animals that have a large component of plant material as part of their diet. So you'll see that around with multiple animals, not just the elephants, but you'll see maybe the great apes will get some. Certainly all of our gazelles are going to get some. And that'll vary according to how much of a browser we consider them as opposed to a grazer. Browser is an animal that's eating mostly leaf matter, and a grazer is an animal that's eating mostly grass, like an elephant.
Love that clarification. Thank you. All right. Okay, another very different one, the Panamanian golden frog.
Right, so these guys are insectivorous, so an insect-based diet. They're also pretty small, so they're going to have smaller insects. Previously in the bird diet, you saw mealworms, and I mentioned that they would have also gotten some crickets and waxworms. Those insect items are going to be a little too big for these guys. So we really go for the small small insects. So these are pinhead crickets. They're teeny tiny, very young crickets, and then fruit flies, which are obviously quite small.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think, oh, all right. So this is another cat example, like we mentioned, where we can see everything you mentioned, that it's kind of similar to our cats at home.
A little bit in that it is an animal-based diet. You know, I know people do feed raw diets at home. It's probably not very common, but most of our cats here are getting a raw-based diet. So yes, it's that diet that I mentioned: the bones, the carcass, which would be a rabbit, and then the beef chunk is just whole muscle meat that we might use for training. They really do like that.
This is just a fun fact I know from our other large cat keepers in the zoo, that they often refer to the feline diet as meatballs. So a lot of the cats in the park love their meatballs, which I know I love meatballs, and I'm sure some of our viewers love meatballs as well. So I think that was our last one. So you can really see from this picture the vast differences and the wide range of foods that we have to have here at the National Zoo. And that's just for 6 species, and that's already over 20 different food items. So now I'm going to give our audience the chance to play nutritionist, and we're going to give you the chance to guess the animal based on the diet. So I'm going to launch this poll here. What animal do you think eats this diet? A leopard, an ape, a snake, or a fox? I'll give you some time on that one. And let's take a look. I think I'm seeing kale, bananas, oranges, apples. I think those are green beans, carrots, broccoli, maybe more lettuce. And these are those pellets on the right-hand side. I'll give you a few more seconds on that poll. We did see a similar one to this. I'm going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, I think our audience members got it. Looks like the majority said ape, followed pretty far behind by fox. So what is the correct answer for this one? This is a gibbon, which is a type of ape. So you all got it. Just like we saw in the gorilla, another type of ape, very similar, lots of vegetables, a little bit of fruit, some pellets, and lots of those leafy greens. All right, we have one more. Let's see, you can again, feel free to put it in the chat if you would like. And I'm gonna launch the second one. What animal do you think eats this diet? Again, we saw a very similar one: a flamingo, an alpaca, an American alligator, or a harbor seal. We have those results coming in. Again, seeing lots of types of fish and some squid there on the right. All right. Give you another few seconds on that poll. You were all getting it. I'm going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, we got it. 97% said harbor seal.
Excellent. Although those of you that said flamingo are not 100% wrong. They don't eat fish necessarily, but they are an aquatic eating species. So
absolutely. What would a flamingo be eating that would be different from this diet?
They actually would not be getting any of these fish. They are eating aquatic insects, basically, or invertebrates. And so krill would be the mainstay of that diet.
Very cool. All right, so we've looked at so many of these different food items. Where does the zoo store, prepare all this food for the 360 species that are here?
Yeah, this is certainly no small task. We have what we call a centralized commissary. And what that means is we have one centralized location within the zoo, and it's behind the scenes area, where we receive, store, prepare all the food for the entire park. We have all the deliveries made there. We are checking in food as it comes in to make sure that it's of good quality. All of the food that we order in is of human grade quality for all the produce that you saw. It's the same thing that's being delivered to your local grocery stores or you'd be eating in a restaurant. We follow all USDA standards for making sure that the foods that we're bringing in are safe for the animals to eat. At the commissary themselves, they are responsible for not only bringing in that food, they're checking it for quality, making sure that we've got a good excuse me, I forgot my word, that our inventory is appropriate. They're ordering food, and then yes, preparing all those diets that we're talking about, making deliveries every single day, getting hay out, getting the browse that we talked about, bamboo for the pandas. They're responsible for taking care of all of that.
Wow, so it's in a whole department. And these are some amazing photos of what that commissary building looks like. And I want to quickly go back to that photo of one of the pantry rooms, because I want our viewers to see if they can find anything that looks familiar to them. Go ahead and put it in the chat. What do you see that you've recognized before on these shelves? Great, I see somebody said jam and juice, jelly. Evelyn, great job. Yes, Seth, we got it too. Great, someone said honey, absolutely. Gatorade, molasses, cereal. So these are all foods. Strauss seems very surprised by the Gatorade. Baby food, absolutely. Pumpkin, applesauce. So these are all foods that a lot of us could probably find at our grocery store that we are also feeding to our zoo animals, right, Erin?
Absolutely. And much of what you're seeing in this picture are not necessarily going to make up bulk items in animal diets. These are going to be very small amounts that we would use for enrichment or training, giving medications to animals that need to take them. So you see lots of things that might be kind of tasty or sweet to kind of make medicines taste better. The Gatorade that somebody had mentioned, that's actually a very good source of electrolytes. So if we need an animal to kind of boost that up a little bit, we use that, or we'll use coconut water. So yes, a whole variety of pantry items that allow us to meet the management needs of these animals in addition to their nutritional requirements.
That's so fascinating. I don't know how many folks in our viewing knew that we give out things like cranberry juice and Gatorade.
Right.
So we saw in some of these pictures some other staff. So this is a whole department of the Department of Nutrition Science that are preparing all of these diets, right?
Right, yes. So we actually have quite a large staff down in the commissary that includes a curator and an assistant curator of nutrition, as well as several animal keepers who you're seeing pictures in many of these pictures, and many volunteers. These guys are absolutely critical to this operation. They take care of all the things that we just talked about, in addition to preparing the diets that I'm formulating.
Wow. So you're basically formulating the diets, and then the zoo, we order all this food, and then the commissary keepers are the ones who are preparing, organizing, sending out every day. So that was a great example of these bins that are delivered to every animal unit for individual animals.
Yeah.
Now, this picture, Ty is looking at this. It's very hard to see the small little paper. And I think we have a close-up picture of exactly what this looks like. So tell us what we're looking at here, Erin.
So this is a diet sheet for our orangutan Batang. And what this is telling you up at the top, this is obviously showing who this animal is. So her scientific name, her common name, her name, and some other identifying type information, where she's located in particular, so that when the diet is prepared, we know where it's being delivered to. And then you start getting into the actual diet itself. And so the first thing listed there are the biscuits that we've been talking about, or the pellets, this commercially manufactured pellet that is intended to really meet the bulk of their nutrition in terms of vitamins and minerals and things like that. And then as you go down, you'll start seeing the other items that we've already mentioned before, lots of greens, a variety of them. She's not just getting one type. There's a potential rotation. And then we get into vegetables. Again, there's a lot type listed, but if you notice, she's not getting every single type every single day. So a little bit of rotation going on there as well. And then smaller amounts of the fruit that we talked about in addition to those root vegetables.
Wow, I did not realize the extent of the variety that every animal is getting and how specific it was. Folks, if you notice in this column, it's down to the gram how much of every diet item every animal in the zoo is getting almost daily. I didn't know that. Audience, did you know that? And go ahead and put in the chat, what is your favorite food item that Batang is getting that you also love? Mine's probably the broccoli or the mango. I noticed that there's another orangutan with broccoli out of his mouth. I noticed at the very bottom of that diet sheet, it mentions enrichment allotment.
Yes.
That very last line, and I think, what does that mean?
So previously when we were looking at that picture from the commissary of the pantry items that had some of the jellies and the jams and the juices and things like that. That allotment is the amount that that animal is allowed to get over the course of one day of those extra type treat items. And it's there so that keepers kind of have a guidance on amounts, but what is used for any particular session, whether it's a training session or delivering meds or maybe some training, or if they need to call them in at the end of the day, it's kind of up to the keeper's discretion what it is they want to use up to that amount. And so they would have a separate sheet that lists everything that is approved for that animal in terms of treat items and what amount of that food item is equivalent to a certain number of calories. And they can mix and match all the way up to, looks like 200 calories for her for that day to get to those extra items.
Very cool. So when we mentioned training, so this is outside of their normal everyday diet. And I like to kind of think about it like when you go to the doctor and maybe get a lollipop as a thank you for going to the doctor and sitting nicely for a shot. That lollipop is sort of like those extra calories allotment for these animals. So you can see some examples here of a sea lion and a seal and a donkey training. And these keepers are using those extra diet allotments to train the animals voluntarily. And then also using those extra enrichment or diet items for enrichment, as we see here. Most notably, we are pretty infamous for giving pretty fancy ice cakes for special occasions. Can you talk to us a little bit about these pictures, what these ice cakes are and made of?
Sure. So first off, we have some very talented people down in the commissary who are responsible for these treats. They take a lot of time, but they are very special. And so what you're seeing with each of these is going to be pre-approved items that probably are already included in that animal's diet. And then on any given day, we also make sure that it's not such a great quantity that it's going to put them off for a couple days, because you can see it can be a lot of food all in one go. So the other thing that we want to make sure of is that it's species appropriate items that are given to these cakes. You know, as pretty as the fruits and vegetables are and how colorful they are, it would not be a good idea to give that to our cats and our tigers. And I'm not actually sure that they would really interact with it much, to be honest. They really prefer the things that are typical of their own diet. So you'll see the blood icicle with chunks of meat sticking out of it. I think at the top of that tiger cake is actually either a horse or cow tail or maybe neck. And then for the beaver, you're seeing biscuit and corn, some of their favorite items. And so what happens is, we have a special occasion coming up. The keeper will request a cake. They'll tell us kind of what it is they're looking for, what size, what the occasion is for. And then our commissary keepers will come up with these masterpieces.
That's amazing. And I don't think it needs mentioning, but obviously the A in STEAM is art. So there's quite a level of artistic beauty when it comes to creating these special enrichment cakes. I love that. And such a joy to watch too. So obviously based on, as you mentioned, keepers doing training and keepers providing enrichment, you're working very closely with the animal keepers themselves.
Yeah, and not just the animal keepers, certainly the curators and the veterinarians as well. One of the things that I come up against in my day-to-day work is that I'll formulate a diet for an animal or an individual with the appropriate foods at the appropriate proportions, and that animal just decides it doesn't like whatever it is I've decided it should be eating. And so I really rely heavily on the keepers to report when that's going on, when an animal is consistently leaving something in their diet. And just like the veterinarians, I also rely on them for feedback on something that could indicate something is off or even wrong. Animals are very good at hiding problems. The keepers know their animals so well, they notice even slight changes that could tell us that we need to take a closer look at what's going on. And kind of just make sure that we're all on the up and up as to how that diet is being accepted by that animal and whether or not any adjustments need to be made.
So just like me and all of our viewers, the animals have different food preferences and might not like what we are putting on their plate.
Sure. I mean, all of us have things that we do and don't like. And so we try to work in a certain amount of flexibility into these diets. And I certainly have alternatives for certain things that would meet the same nutrient composition for that item, but would be in a different form, whether it's a different texture or a different flavor, maybe even a different color. There are certainly some animals out there that will just refuse anything that's orange. And so generally when I talk about things like vegetables and fruits, anything that falls into those broad categories is pretty interchangeable. So if I get something that comes back saying, this animal is never eating its carrots, can we try something else? I'm like, sure, we'll give it a sweet potato. Or we might try, a regular potato, something like that. Same thing with fruits, although I will admit that fruits are less often refused. They are some of the most favorite items in the zoo, but you might have some individual preferences in there as well. We also build in the same flexibility with those manufactured feeds we talked about. With the primate biscuits in particular, we've got probably upwards of half a dozen different types, and they've all got different shapes and sizes and colors and flavors. And so we're able to kind of rotate those around so that things don't get boring. And we also have options for animals that decide that that particular one just isn't for them.
That sounds like a large amount of flexibility you need with these diets, but there's even another level, a few more levels of flexibility when it comes to changing animal diets.
Right. So, an animal not eating a certain component of their diet is a pretty simple example of when a diet change might be required, but there's certainly going to be other points in an animal's life when we need to make a change. And so things over the course could be different.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes sense. In an animal's life, just like in humans, nutritional needs change. What I needed as a baby are different than what I need now. Viewers, chime in the chat. What are some things that are some differences in what you ate as a baby versus what you ate now? And what are some of these differences from what you're feeding maybe younger animals to older animals?
So sure. I mean, things change not just necessarily in nutrient needs, but also in the types of food that they can and will eat. And so when we're talking about, mammals in particular, it's kind of an easy example because we all know that their first diet is actually mother's milk. And so they require that for the first stage of their life. And then as they grow and wean off of mom, they will start eating other components of their solid diet or what's going to become their adult diet. And you can't just start off with the adult diet as it is. You kind of have to work them up towards that. They might be having teeth that are erupting. They might be still learning how to actually chew and swallow and manipulate and hold their foods, or however it is that they get their food. So we have to make choices that are appropriate for them as a species, but also, kind of guarantee success, that they wean on to the right foods. We don't want to be in a situation where an animal comes off of its baby food, if you will, and goes right into just fruits and ignores the pellet. And so we might have to do some things to that diet to encourage them to eat the not so tasty parts. And then even as an animal grows throughout its life, we're going to have to deal with changes in reproductive state. So if you have an animal that's going from a growing stage into a maintenance stage, or from a maintenance stage into reproductive, or even post-reproductive and now into your geriatric years, we will make diet changes along the way in order to accommodate those changes that we're seeing.
Yeah, we have a lot of responses in the chat that as folks were younger, they ate maybe baby food and milk, and now they eat everything, mac and cheese and McDonald's. And someone said that they eat sushi, where they, as a baby, were eating mostly formula, Evelyn said. That's great. And then maybe as folks age, I know some of our geriatric, our older animals might lose some teeth. And so maybe they go back to having to eat some softer foods. You mentioned another change that I'd love to touch on. You said seasonality changes.
Right.
What sort of changes? So this is every season you're making changes for some animals?
Potentially. So obviously some animals go through seasonal changes within their diet based on what's available naturally. And in some cases, in particular with this example with the migratory birds, whether or not the food that we present to them in captivity changes, they change their body weight, they change their fat composition, they are ready to migrate, they're ready to go regardless of whether they're actually going to. So we change those animals' diets according to those seasons, a little bit ahead of it. So right now, we're actually already talking, we're going to start getting out of the winter or non-breeding season with our migratory birds, and we're going to start moving into the breeding season as we head towards probably March and April. And so when we talked about the Baltimore Oriole diet previously, you saw that that diet was mostly insects. Right now, his diet is actually mostly plant-based items. So it's that pellet and produce mix and that egg mix. As they move into breeding season, that's going to kind of flip-flop, and it's going to wind up becoming the majority insects again, and we'll reduce back those other components.
Very cool. So you mentioned all of these different changes, and once again, reiterating that there are 360 species in the zoo. It sounds like you're always adjusting somebody's diet. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, on a typical day, I mean, I would say a slow day is when I have maybe 3 or 4 diet changes, but I certainly have days or weeks where I'm doing 10, 12, maybe even 15 diet changes. You know, when we do these changes for these migratory birds, we've got upwards of 100 now. So over the course of a week or two, I'll be making over 100 diet changes just for those groups of animals.
Wow. So there's another problem that you're constantly solving that I want to touch on, is that when you have animals that are living in groups, what do you do when one animal might need a certain amount of a diet, but a different animal living in that same group needs maybe less of a diet? But if they're sharing space, how do you kind of control what they're eating?
Right. So that can actually be one of the more challenging parts of my jobs, when we call it either a group setting or a mixed species setting, even, where not only do you have multiple animals, but they also have different species and they all have different needs. So I guess one of the best examples we have in terms of controlling amounts being given for animals that are on 2 ends of the spectrum for weight would be Ambika and Bosie, our elephants. We had a situation. Elephants obviously are a very social species, and so it's not really possible for us to always keep them separated for everything. We are able to separate them for some food items, but for the bulk of their day, they're together and they're socializing. And so we had to find a way for this particular group to make sure that Ambika was getting what she needed while Bosie wasn't getting too much. And so Ambika, for those of you who don't know, she was one of our geriatric elephants. She was I believe, one of the longest lived elephants in at least North America. But as she aged, she started losing body condition. And so we had to make some specific diet changes for her to help her maintain her weight and stay at a healthy place. And unfortunately, what that meant for Bosie, who was a bit younger, it meant that she now had access to much more digestible food and put on a lot of weight. And so the strategy was, we were going to manage for the animal that needed our help the most. And so we kept Ambika at a good body condition. And we kind of allowed Bosie to maintain a little bit higher, knowing that at some point this was going to change and we were going to have to bring her back down. But for the benefit of the herd as a whole, that was the decision we had to make. And as you can see from the pictures here, Bosie was a little bit large.
She was. So in this case, you prioritized the health and welfare of Ambika, one of the elephants living in this herd, knowing that you'll be able to address Bosie's condition at a little bit later of a time.
Right. And Bosie certainly still had her own specific diet, and we were monitoring her very closely and making sure that we were comfortable with what she was getting. So yeah, we were having to make a choice for the group as a whole.
So you mentioned this word body conditioning. How are you monitoring the health and overall well-being and the condition of all of these animals?
So body condition actually is a great place to start. So when I say body condition, what it means is I am looking at an animal's overall body, or feeling an animal's overall body, depending on the situation. In the case of the elephants, we have a specific scale, and you can see that here now. That shows scores of 2, 4, 6, and 8. It's actually a 1 to 9 scale. 1 is emaciated, 9 is obese. And so what you're looking at is different landmarks on the body and determining what bony processes you are or are not able to make out. And if you do see them, how visible are they? How prominent are they? And so in this case, ideally, you would want to make sure you could see the outline of the hips, you'd see the outline of the shoulders, you'd see the outline of the tail, the rump, maybe the outline of the rib cage, and you'd certainly want to see the top of their spine.
All right, so I did launch another poll to give our viewers a chance to guess how they would body condition score Bosie here, and I'll give you some time on that. So you mentioned that you do touch some animals. Obviously, an animal like an elephant, you're not going to go in and touch. We manage them through what's called protected contact. But some animals are trained for you to physically feel them. And for our viewers watching who have maybe been to the vet with your pets, you maybe have seen the vet feel for your dog or cat's ribs or hips. It's similar to that, right?
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, it depends on the species. An elephant, even if it was safe for us to have contact with them, their skin is so thick that I would not actually be able to palpate much what was going on there. So they are much better, more suited to a visual body condition score. Many of the other animals, they just don't score visually very well. And I have to often wait until they're up at the vet hospital for maybe a routine exam with the veterinarians. And I will go down and actually get hands on that animal. When you think of our fuzzy animals, like maybe, some of our great apes and some of the other primates, the way that they sit and the way their fur lays, it's not very easy to see what the condition is like underneath there. And so I'll have to actually palpate those animals.
So it did just end the poll, and it looks like the majority would have conditioned or scored Bosie as an 8. Is that what you would have scored her as?
Yes, at that point, she was an 8 out of 9.
But again, just to reiterate, we do have the picture of where she is today or where she was in 2021.
Yeah, so I just got eyes on her last week. And a first for me, she actually got a diet increase. So she's looking great. She's doing great. We're very happy with where she's at right now.
It's fantastic. We are approaching our Q&A time, but I do just want to ask, Erin, how did you get here? What was your road to becoming a clinical animal nutritionist?
Oh, so for me, I was always interested in working with animals for as long as I can remember. And specifically, I wanted to be in a zoo setting. And up until college, I had planned on being a zoo veterinarian. When I asked my school advisor, I want to work with animals, what should I do? And they kind of had 2 answers for me. You can be a zookeeper or you can be a zoo vet. I chose zoo vet, and that's where I thought I was going to wind up being. But after working in a few clinics, I decided it really wasn't for me, actually. And so I got more into research, and then I decided to continue on with the master's program while I kind of figured out what other options were out there. My advisor at the time, who I went on to do my master's with, had captive blue duikers. It's a small antelope from Africa. She knew that I was interested in African animals. She didn't really have anybody working with them at the time, so we started talking about possible projects. Also, her work focused on nutritional ecology, and so that's kind of the direction I started to go. We started investigating how a small ruminant survived on a diet composed largely of fruits. And typically those are 2 things that don't usually describe a ruminant. Just so you know, a ruminant is an animal that chews its cud like a cow. So I quickly realized, once I started doing that this was exactly what I was interested in. Everything that I was interested in terms of animal health, behavior, reproduction, population management, ecology, conservation, it all came back to nutrition. A year later, I attended my first nutrition conference. I had no idea that career even existed, let alone that enough professionals were out there to hold a regular conference. Wow. So I used that opportunity to make contacts. I kept up my studies, and the rest is history.
That's great. And I just want to reiterate, I think that's a very common feeling that a lot of people in zoos, and maybe our audience watching, think is that the only way to work with animals and in conservation is to be an animal keeper or a vet. But again, the purpose of this series is to show the variety of careers in conservation and working with animals. So last question before we jump to our Q&A, what advice do you have for any of our viewers that might be interested in a similar career?
So I really hope that this field continues to grow as we educate more people about its importance and its existence. But the fact of the matter is, this is a small field. As of right now, there are about 20 zoo nutritionists working in North America right now. So I'm not going to say it's an easy career to get into because of the limited positions currently available. But as I mentioned, as more facilities recognize the value of this profession and that having a dedicated person to the nutritional management of their collection is really important, I think more positions are going to be created. So if you think this is your passion, prepare yourself with science classes, read what you can, develop your writing and communication skills. The animals are the best part of this job, but mostly I work with people and do a lot of writing and a lot of emails, a lot of phone conversations. Look for opportunities at animal clinics and rescues where you can, learn about feeding animals, and start reaching out to people who do what you think you might want to do and talk to them how they got there.
I love that. So again, just to reiterate the scope of this, she said only 20 animal nutritionists are working in zoos across North America. And both you and Mike Maslenko, who's in the chat, are both working for all the animals here at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and our Front Royal facility, the Conservation Biology Institute. So again, for you viewers watching, hopefully a growing field, and if you're interested to pursue it. So I realize we are about 10 minutes out, so I am going to launch our closing poll. I know some folks might need to move on to their next class, but continue to throw your questions in the Q&A, and let's get going. So we had a question of, do you have a favorite animal or type of animal to work with?
Oh, that is a difficult question to answer because my favorite animal almost changes depending on what I'm focused on at that time. But if you're going to force me to pick one, my absolute favorite is one that we actually don't have at this zoo, but many of you probably have at some of your zoos. It's a black rhino. They're just cool animals. I can't really describe what makes me gravitate towards them, but they're just cool animals. And of course, I always have to mention the blue duikers. I worked with them for a couple of years during my master's. Once they weren't so nervous around me, they just wanted to come up and have their head scratched. They really were just special little animals.
I love that. Some folks in the chat said tiger was their favorite, or wolf. Mary has a really great question of, during the pandemic, has it been harder to get some of the food items that our animals like or want?
You know, initially we thought we were going to run into some of those issues. Certainly there were slowdowns in the supply chain that we've all heard about, but for the most part, we've been able to get what it is we need. We haven't really had to make any changes to the diets of the animals, fortunately. So we've been pretty solid on that front.
That's great. And Diana asked, can you explain a little bit more what a pellet is and how it's made?
Sure. So pellet, I don't know if I can go into great detail about how it's made, but basically it's going to be a number of different ingredients, just like you might find on a bag of dog food or cat food like we talked about. In the case of the primate diets that we were talking about, a lot of those might be soy-based. In the case of the herbivores, those might be alfalfa or maybe even aspen-based. In the dogs and cats, that might be beef or chicken-based. But they're basically going to be a formulation of whatever appropriate food item is for that animal, ground up into a tiny particle size. And then they're going to add in additional minerals and vitamins that balance it for that species type. And so in theory, they could eat that as 100% of their diet and meet their needs. In most cases, I'm not gonna say in every case, but in most cases. And so it's really meant to kind of specifically meet the needs of those animals. They come in a different variety of forms. Some of them can be cooked, some can be what they call extruded, which is pushed through kind of metal dies at different sizes at really high pressures. Some of them can be puffed up so that it's a lighter material. So I'm not real good at the food science behind all this, but basically a dried food item specific to that animal.
And I actually think we have a picture of you creating your own pellets, right?
Yeah.
Which was a special case, I think, that occasionally you have to get even more creative and come up with brand new diet items.
Right. Yeah, these were biscuits for Tien Tien, our older male panda. A couple years ago, he went through a period where we just couldn't get him to maintain body weight the way we would have liked. And so we started making special biscuits. And these are what kind of got him through that period. And that amount that you see on the right was about 2 weeks worth.
Wow. Wow. We have another question here that someone has seen that the orangutans may eat onions. Do they really like them, and how come they can eat them but dogs can't?
Oh, that's a great question. So yes, they can eat them. Yes, they have eaten them. They have had onions in their diet. They've also had leeks, which is similar, but not the same, but kind of in the same flavor profile. They did seem to prefer them for a while, but it's just part of the rotation of vegetables that we have with their diet. And I mentioned before, we don't want to offer the same thing every single day. We kind of mix it up, and that just happens to be one of the vegetables within our rotation. Domestic dogs, and in particular certain breeds, do have issues with onions, and then there's a certain chemical in onions that they just cannot break down. It's actually toxic to them. Primates don't have that issue, and so we are able to safely feed onions to a variety of species that at the zoo, including the apes. But no, we would not include them in a canine diet just for that reason. Even if we had no reason to think that it would be a problem, we wouldn't take that chance.
So we saw that I believe hay made up about 80% of the elephant diet. So for such large elephants, how many pounds of hay is an elephant either eating or being provided a day?
Ooh. You're gonna make me pull up my references because I don't have these numbers off the top of my head. Let's see here. It's a lot. And one thing I will say about our hay, we're actually one of the few zoos in the country who we grow and make our own hay. We have several fields out at Pantry Royal at SCBI. Mike does most of the management of that in terms of planning for when things are going to be planted and then cut and baled up and stored. And so we'll have that delivered to the zoo. In terms of usage for hay, for the total zoo, we're going through about 360,000 pounds per year.
360,000 pounds of hay a year.
Right.
Zoo-wide.
A lot.
That
a lot of bales.
A lot. And I understand after hearing that number why it sort of makes sense for us to grow and bale our own. That's amazing. So I think last question from the Q&A. I know we're running short on time and you all have some fantastic questions. Kelly would like to know, what was the hardest diet to create?
Ooh. Give me a second to think about that one. It's funny, I get this question a lot, to be honest, and it kind of is always changing. I would say right now, what I've got going on currently, the bird diets were kind of a challenge and kind of continue to be, not necessarily because they were hard to formulate, but because we're trying to manage so much with their body condition and the changes we see over seasonality, and then throwing in breeding season and rearing chicks. And so they posed a pretty good challenge. We're at a really good place now. We've had a couple seasons to practice now. We've made some tweaks. We've added in some things like canthaxanthin, which is a carotenoid that you might be more familiar with our flamingos. That's what makes them pink. And so we actually have a food item that we might put into some of the bird diets to help them get red feathers. We've also added in some spirulina powder because that's also got some additional carotenoids and things that might be helping with feather health. And so making the alterations and really trying to nail down what it is that these birds need over the course of the year for all of those things I just mentioned has been pretty challenging. One of the other things that kind of comes up isn't necessarily a nutrition problem, but it's certainly a challenge and kind of a frustration is when you do have an animal that has some sort of illness and we're trying anything and everything we can think of to get that animal to eat, and they just absolutely refuse everything, even the things that they should be, normally love. Yeah. Many of you are aware that we went through recently, many of our big cats wound up with COVID. And so when we were dealing with that, just like when you're sick, they really didn't want to eat anything. And so we started raiding grocery store shelves, and I got all sorts of meat-based baby foods and all sorts of things that I thought maybe they'll go for that. And that's what we wound up doing. And, here I was a zoo nutritionist walking through a grocery store with 50 jars of baby food in my grocery cart.
Baby food for our lions and tigers that have now thankfully recovered successfully from COVID.
Yeah, they're all doing fabulously.
Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining us today for UnZOOsual Careers. I have learned so much about what it means to be a clinical animal nutritionist, and I'm sure that our viewers did as well. Do you have any final words for our viewers?
I think the one thing I would leave you guys with is, at least in my own personal experience, and hopefully this resonates with you too, sometimes gaining experience working in a field is going to show you exactly where you need to be. But sometimes it shows you where you shouldn't be. And that's certainly what happened in my case. So don't be afraid to change your mind about your goals as you learn about who you are and what it is you like to do and what other opportunities exist out there.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us for our next installment of UnZOOsual Careers on Friday, March 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Those links to register are in the chat. And again, we'd love your feedback on today's program. You will see a survey pop up when we close the webinar. Educators, please take a few minutes to fill it out. And to catch up on all of the UnZOOsual Careers, check out our YouTube playlist, also in the chat. On behalf of the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute, we hope you have a wild day.